last week. The Reverend George Miller was here, and he preached about what he called nudges. And what he meant by nudges were those sometimes gentle and sometimes kind of full-scale emergency alert things we get from God saying, you know, you need to go out and you do something. Those nudges that invite us to remember the promises of our faith. Both the promises that our parents make for us if we are baptized, the promises we make if we're confirmed into the church, the promises we make when we join a church, and the promises that God makes to us. And so it's these nudges to go out and transform the world in some way. Now you may have also noticed on the cover of your bulletin this morning is a very, un-Jesus-y kind of picture. And some of you have been sitting there going, what does this have to do? Like with anything theological, much less last week's sermon and the one before, that's what I'm going to tell you. But we're going to begin with a one-question quiz. How many of you ever watched Mission Impossible on television? Yes, lots of MI fans. And how many of you have seen one or more of the Tom Cruise movies that he's been making unbelievably for 23 years? Okay, for anybody who has never ever seen a Mission Impossible series, you need to know that every single episode begins exactly the same way. The current leader of the MI team used to be Jim Phelps, portrayed by that handsome devil Peter Graves, or more recently Ethan Hunt, portrayed by that handsome devil Tom Cruise. They go out to a city park or a baseball diamond or a little restaurant or something, and they sit down on a chair or a bench or a piece of statuary, and after looking around to make sure nobody's watching, they grope underneath the bench and they pull out a packet. And in the old days, the packet was about this big because it had a tape recorder in it, and it had printed photos. Tom Cruise's packets were a little smaller because they typically have a laptop or they have a cell phone in it that has all the information underneath. And when they play the tape or the recording, it tells them what their mission is. Starts out, explains what the task is confronting the team and what it is they need to do to solve a problem. So for example, Dr. Ellen Benson, the Nobel Prize-winning microbiologist, has just developed a new strain of flesh-eating bacteria. If the vials of bacteria are not found within the next 48 hours, Dr. Benson is prepared to release the bacteria into the water systems of 9 major cities, destroying their populations. Destruction was very big in Mission Impossible, and it always concluded with the same words, your mission, Jim, or Ethan, or whoever was the leader, should you decide to accept it, is to whatever it is they needed to do to go out and save the world. And then a little spiral of smoke would come out of the tape recorder or the laptop or the whatever, leaving the Mission Impossible team leader and his team to once again face the ethical and moral question, would they accept this mission? And television and TV and movies and things like that being what they are, of course they would accept this mission, or they wouldn't have been on television or on movies. If we change channels from the world of Mission Impossible to the world of the Bible, what is astonishing is how many similar stories we find. Like the one this morning about the prophet Jonah, who sits down on a rock and reaches under it, and he finds his hidden tape recorder, and the voice of God comes out and says, Jonah, the people of Nineveh have become very evil, and your mission, should you decide to accept it, is to go to the city and cry out against it. Okay, that doesn't sound that tough, right? You go to the city, rent a public speaking space, and tell them all the things that they're doing wrong. But it was a little more challenging than it sounds, and just in case you might have forgotten some of your ancient Middle Eastern geography, I want to remind you that Nineveh was the capital city of the nation of Assyria. And at that time in history, Assyria was one of the most powerful nations in the known world. They had had a series of brilliant political and military leaders. They had conquered all of the nations around them. They had gotten all this booty and all these prisoners. And they had built these fabulous cities, including the city of Nineveh, which had gorgeous temples and museums, one of the finest libraries in the ancient world. Nineveh was a lot like the Chicago or the New York or the San Francisco of its day. And one thing Jonah knew about the people of Nineveh was that they were what his people, the Jewish people, called pagans. The city of Nineveh was made up mostly of Gentiles, very few Jewish people in the population, and perhaps not surprisingly, because of all their wealth and their status and their power and all those other things, some of them might have gotten a little bit above themselves. He didn't know, or was pretty sure, that if he, this completely unknown, unimportant Jewish prophet, walked into the gates of this powerful city and said, okay, here's how you're doing it wrong, and you better shape up or you're going to get destroyed, he probably was not going to be very welcome. At the very least, we can expect he might have gotten booed. He might have gotten locked up. He might have gotten tortured. The pretty likely thing is that he would have missed some really nasty execution. And so unlike Jim Phelps or Ethan Hunt or the MI team members who always accepted whatever mission they were assigned, Jonah immediately turns tail, jumps on a ship that's headed in the opposite direction from Nineveh, and sets sail trying to flee from the Lord and what the Lord is asking him to do. It's just a rerun of the Moses story that happened some 500 years earlier. Most of us think of Moses as this very holy and very faithful man. He marches up the mountain, comes down with the Ten Commandments, all that kind of stuff. But if you read the 3rd and 4th chapters of Exodus, you're going to find out Moses was a man who did not want to be on a mission from God. That little passage you heard this morning, he's out minding his own business. He's herding his flocks, looking at the weather, wondering if it's ever going to rain again. And God shows up in person to give him his mission. God says, just in case you've forgotten, Moses, your people, the Israelites, have been in slavery in Egypt for hundreds of years, and they are suffering terribly. And your job's to go down and convince the Pharaoh to let them all go, free them from slavery, and oh, by the way, after you've done that, you're going to lead them to a broad land flowing with milk and honey. Now, Jonah just jumps ship. Moses decides to argue. In fact, given that Moses happened before Jonah, maybe Jonah was paying attention. It's why he jumped ship instead of arguing. But Moses decides to argue with God. And the first thing he says is, Lord, I'm nobody. I mean, I am nothing. Who am I that you are asking me to do this thing? A powerful ruler like the Pharaoh is never going to listen to me in a bazillion years. God says, no worries, Moses. I will go with you. Moses decides to try a more persuasive argument, and he points out, okay, theologically, since this is a mission from God, even the Jewish people don't know God's real name. The name of God was so holy, you didn't say it. And he says, Yahweh, Almighty One, what's going to happen when I go down? They don't even have never heard of the God of Jews, and I say that I'm here on your behalf, and you want the Pharaoh to let go of all of their slaves who are keeping their economy going. And God says, tell them I am. persuasive, and he goes on arguing in some sections we didn't hear and we'll talk about this morning. But then he gets down to his last argument. He says, Yahweh, you have picked the wrong person for this job. I do not have the skills that are required to do this thing. He says, I'm tongue-tied. I don't speak well in front of large audiences. I cannot think on my feet. God says, no worries. I'll tell you what to say when you get there. And Moses' final plea is so heartfelt, and it is so much our plea when we get these messages from God. He says, oh my Lord, please send someone else. And God says, nope, this is your mission. You're the only one who can do it. And across the ages that are recounted in the Bible, we know that God calls all kinds of other would-be faithful people, people like Isaiah and Esther, Abraham and Sarah, Mary, the mother of Jesus, all those disciples. And the reason that these two little stories we're reflecting on this morning are more than just kind of nice little Bible stories is because our faith also tells us. Because we affirm that we believe in a still speaking God. A God who continues to come not just to the special people, but comes to every single one of us who are sitting here today and calls us to missions too, with nudges and tasks that need to be done. Now, the good news, I think, is that unlike the missions that the MI teams got, which were things like saving New York City or saving the state of Vermont or saving the world, most of the missions we get called to are a lot smaller. They require a lot smaller amount of our resources or our energy or our time or our other gifts to do something to make the world a better place, the kind of world God yearns for it to be. And so there are things like, Andrea, we need some teachers for our Sunday school classes this year. You'd only have to teach one session, and I'd like you to try to do it. Or there might be a message like, Annie, we really need to help out the children and the families in our community who can't afford school supplies. I'd really like you to bring something in to put in our collection bin. Or maybe something like, Joanne, we really need someone to take the bulletins and our other recyclable paper down to the recycling center, and I sort of sense you have a passion for the environment. I'd like you to do that. And each and every one of those small missions we get called to is deeply important. We can shrug it off. We can go, oh man, how much difference can teaching one Sunday school class make, or bringing in a couple packs of pencils or pens? They matter. Every single healing, positive thing that we do matters and helps to transform this world. A friend of mine who happens to be here this morning, I didn't know she was going to be, but sent me a quotation a while back. I'd never read this anywhere before. A woman named Janice Stansfield, she says, we cannot do all the good that the world needs, but the world needs whatever good it is that we can do. Sometimes we get really, really big missions. We're called to use really big chunks of time and energy and resources to try to make really big changes in the world. And just as one example, drawing on this week's news, we might be given the mission as faithful people of taking a long, hard look at the problems of gun violence in this country. And we may be given the mission of not just thinking about or praying for the people suffering, although those are very important things to do too. We must think, we must pray, but to do something beyond that. This church at one time gave out free gun locks. I think we even still have some. And this morning, if you'd like to, while you're having your lunch, if you want some assistance, if you're interested in doing this and writing a letter to our senators, asking them to take some action on gun violence, will help you do that kind of thing too. The United Methodists, I blush to admit they are ahead of the United Church of Christ, but this week, the United Methodists on their website published a list of 10 things that United Methodists can do to help curb gun violence. And I sent the link to Beth, and so if you want the link, or you can just go onto the United Methodist website, practical things like gun safety. If you have guns in your home, lock them up, secure them. Other kinds of things we can do, like writing letters. Other things I'd never even thought about, real things that we really can do to try and stem some of the violence we're seeing in our country. Now, sometimes it's not always all that clear, the difference between those small missions and maybe a really big mission. In the news this week, a couple of nights after the shootings in El Paso, one of the national news stations carried a story about a little 11-year-old boy named Reuben and his mother. And the day of the shootings, not surprisingly, Reuben was terrified. The people in El Paso were terrified. And many of them were terrified because they had already learned that the gunman was deliberately trying to kill people who were Hispanic. And Reuben was crying and worried about all of the people in the community who were crying and grieving. And he went to his mother, he says, "Mama, what can we do to help?" And she said, "Boy, that is a really hard question, Reuben. I've got to think about it." She said, "Why don't you go in your room with your stuffed animals and stuff and sit down and think about it a little bit, and then we can talk some more." And a little while later, this little 11-year-old came out with this little handwritten on a piece of notebook paper list that he had made, and an idea. And his idea has become called in the news and on social media the El Paso Challenge. And Reuben's idea was that every single person in El Paso, and it has spread far beyond El Paso to wider Texas to all across the country, every single person should commit 20 acts of kindness as a way of honoring each of the 20 people who had died in that first onslaught. And Reuben even made a list of things people could do. You could mow somebody else's lawn. He's 11. He can do that. You could maybe pay for somebody's meal. You could maybe take flowers to someone. His last time, one thing we can all do is we can look at somebody else we run into and we can tell them how great they are and how important they are to us. And then he started promoting how to promote it, and he said, what people could do is they could make posters and go stand in the malls and then explain about the El Paso Challenge, and you could go on your Facebook site. And then he started going out and actually modeling for people. He went out, he and his mom went to Taco Bell for supper, and he approached this group of total strangers, and he says, "I'm challenging you to be part of the El Paso Challenge." And of course, this had just happened, and they all went that way. And he explained it to them, and several people in the group said, "We can do that. We will do that." The next night, he and his mom made dinners and took them to all of the first responders who showed up at the Walmart the day of the shootings. And the next night, he took candy that he had bought with his allowance, and he took it to a local restaurant and passed it out to everybody who looked like they needed a piece of candy. And the next night, he and his mom took roses to the emergency room personnel who had treated so many of the victims, and to the families of the survivors who were still there in the hospital. Reuben's mission, Reuben's call is really simple. Do kindness. do kindness. It seems so simple to say and think that, and yet it can be incredibly hard for us. A lot of us end up looking a whole lot like Jonah and Moses and all those other people who turn tail and run away and make excuses and argue with God. And a lot of times we do that because we are afraid that if we really accept this mission we've been given, it's going to cost us something. It's going to cost us time. It's going to cost us energy. It's going to cost us, what will our neighbors think of us if we start running around saying crazy things like, maybe it's not okay that we are killing people, innocent people, every single week of the year in this nation. And golly whiz, other countries that have gun laws don't have that problem. Hard or easy, a mission means that we take whatever task it is that we do, and it may be just keeping on doing what we're doing right now. I mean, Jonah didn't stop being a prophet when he finally accepted God's mission, and Moses didn't stop being a herder for a while until he did some other kinds of things. And we don't have to stop doing what we're doing, but we learn to do it from a different framework. We learn to do it from a different perspective. What changes is our understanding of the meaning of our work. It's not just a task we're doing or something that our pastor nagged us into. It's a chance to be in partnership with our God. I'm going to close with a very, very short, but one of my favorite stories that comes from a book by David Wolpe that's called Teaching Your Children About God. And it doesn't include kittens. It includes other things. And the story tells about a man who stood before God, and this man was weeping, sobbing, brokenhearted because of all the pain and distress and suffering in the world. And he cries out to God, and he says, look at all these things that are broken and damaged, how many people are hurting. Why don't you do something? And God looks at him with love, and he says, I did. I sent you. I sent you. And so God has. God sends us today. God keeps right on sending us in spite of our arguments, and our objections, and our resistance, and our everything else. And every time we object, God just says, hey, you've heard the mission that needs doing. You know what the mission is that needs doing. And your mission, Beth, or Mark, or Ken, or Creta, or Shirley, or whoever. Your mission, should you decide to accept it, is to go to do whatever thing it is you can do to try to make this world a better place. And only you can decide whether you'll accept it or not. Amen.
Amen.